The best thing that you as a tenant can do if you are looking to get out of your lease as a result of hardship you're suffering due to the coronavirus is to speak to your landlord. Try and come to an agreement with them as a starting point. If you're unable to do that, then there's other options available to you. These can include going through a dispute resolution process, which is offered by the Residential Tenancies Authority, free of charge. Or if that's not successful, you can go further and take your claim to QCAT for a determination. When negotiating rent with your landlord, there are two main things you should consider. The first one is, what is your financial position? How much rent will you be able to pay? And how much income have you lost as a result of COVID-19? The second thing to keep in mind is that quite often the landlord will have its own financial obligations relating to the lease. With that being the case, there may only be so much the landlord can do in relation to reducing rent or making other changes to the lease. Where you look to negotiate a rental reduction with your landlord, there's a few things you should consider. Number one is making sure that you have sufficient evidence to back up your claim. The Queensland Government has introduced guidelines which require landlords and tenants to negotiate a reduction of rent in certain circumstances. In short, these require tenants to show that either they have had a greater than 25% reduction in their income, or that the rent they're required to pay exceeds 30% of their total income. And this is calculated on the basis of the pooled income of all tenants. In any event, the key is to be proactive and to start speaking to your landlord sooner rather than later, and definitely before you've fallen into arrears of rent. And finally, you should ensure that any agreement you reach is in writing and in the required form. When it comes to getting the right advice, we strongly suggest that you consider speaking with industry bodies who are set up for the sole purpose of assisting landlords and tenants in times like these. These include speaking to the Residential Tenancies Authority or Tenants Queensland. McInnes Wilson Lawyers also offers a free consultation service over the phone for any tenants who are suffering hardship at this time. The changes which have been brought in by the Queensland Government introduce a moratorium on evictions due to non-payment of rent. What this means, in short, is that if you are suffering excessive hardship as a result of COVID-19, you cannot be evicted from your property until the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, it's important to understand that this moratorium only applies where, as a tenant, you are suffering from excessive financial hardship, which is in line with the criteria I mentioned earlier. Those being, you need to show that you've either had a 25% reduction in your income or that the rent you're required to pay exceeds 30% of your income. As a landlord, you still have a number of rights, notwithstanding the COVID-19 pandemic. Whilst there is a moratorium in place for evictions due to non-payment of rent, landlords will still have rights to evict for other reasons, particularly where the tenant has breached the lease other than in relation to non-payment of rent. Landlords will still have the right, for example, to require tenants to leave in the event they are looking to sell the property or to move back into it themselves. In those circumstances, they will need to provide at least 2 months' notice to the tenant. For a lot of landlords, payment of their mortgage can be one of their biggest stresses in a time like this. It's important to understand that as a landlord, any rental reduction you pass on to a tenant isn't automatically coming off your mortgage. And so as a landlord, it's very important that as a part of any negotiations with your tenant, it's very important that you speak to your mortgagee so that you can understand what relief they are willing to provide to you and factor this into your negotiations with the tenant. And this is obviously something which should be done prior to agreeing to any reduction in rent. One of the questions we're often asked by tenants is, if I have to pay less rent now, am I going to have to pay it back once this whole pandemic is over? And the answer to that is, it all depends on the agreement you reach with your landlord. One of the things which the Queensland Government has made clear is that they want landlords and tenants to discuss options which are available and come to their own agreement. What this means in relation to rent reductions is that these can take a number of different forms. These include a waiver of the rent, which basically means that you will not have to pay back the amount of the rent which is waived. Secondly, is a reduction in rent, which means that you'll pay a lower rent for a certain period of time. And the third most common one is a deferral of rent. Put simply, what this means is that where an agreement is reached to reduce the rent by a certain amount, the landlord and tenant can agree that some or all of that reduction is not waived, but is deferred to be paid back at a later time. So once again, this is another issue which should be carefully considered when you're looking to negotiate with your landlord.